Shalom and welcome to Life Lessons. We are on segment 31, Parshat Emor, in the book of Leviticus, known as Chumash Vayikra. We had come from the previous section that was called Kedoshim, Holy, that talked about the sanctification, many laws, how we should be more holier, and things to help us to connect to the Almighty in even abstaining at things that are allowed. We should be more careful. So here it continues with the theme, and it's talking to the priest, what are the laws to pertains, how did they get inducted, and what pertains to them specifically. That's how the section begins. And then towards the end, it's going to talk about the festivals, beginning of the Sabbath, and then about the holiday of Passover, the holiday of Shavuot, when we receive the Torah, and Sukkot. But the first thing is, in our section over here, is an interesting verse, the way the verse starts. The verse says as follows, and Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, and God spoke to Moshe, said to Moshe, Emor el HaKohanim. He said, speak to the priest, Bnei Aaron, the children of Aaron, V'amarta alehem, and you should say to them. And what you should say to them, he talks about ritual purity. Lenefesh lo yitama be'amav. Let no priest become ritually impure by touching a dead corpse, as the laws was during temple times. But what stands out here is the language. The language is repetitive. It says 2 times. It says, speak to the priest, and then it says, say to them. Why 2 times? In Hebrew, that's the word emor. Emor. Speak to the children speak to the Kohanim, ve'amarta, and you should say. 2 times say. Don't need to repeat. You could just say it. Speak to them, and you say the following. Why 2 times? So before we answer this question, the other thing is that we need to bring out that in Hebrew, when the word speak or say is mentioned, there's different expressions how to say it. Many times in the Torah, we say the word Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe. God spoke to Moshe, to Moses. But the word then for speaking is daber. Here we encounter not the word daber, but the word emor. What is the difference? The difference is, one is a stronger way of language, affirmative. Speak to them, say clearly, that's the way it is. But then if it's a soft kind of speaking, speaking with a smile, speaking with a softer note, then it's the word emor. And this is what we encounter over here. So many times in the Torah, the way we look on it, God is not looking how this message is being delivered. He's just looking at the fact, those are the details. This is what I want. Figure it out how exactly you're going to do it. But you need to do so and so. So that's daber. Speak to the Bnei Israel, children of Israel, Moses. Tell them that's what needs to be done. They need to keep the Sabbath, they need to do this, they need to do that. Here all of a sudden, when he speaks about the laws of impurity, there is a language here of a softer language, emor. Say to them in a softer tone. What is it? So our sages tell us that the fact itself that it repeated itself, it's telling us something else. It's also telling us that the adults need to give this over to their children. That is what the repetition of 2 times saying. So, as the commentator Rashi says, and I quote here, speak and say, that means telling the priests themselves to observe the following precepts, and then the adults should tell their children. So the fact itself that it repeats itself 2 times the word saying, so 1 time saying is to the adults, And the other time, what does it mean? Say to them, in other words, we expect from you that you should repeat this to the children. The idea of education. The idea is that from when the child is younger, you need to educate them. And if we're talking about the priest, that they should be aware of all the laws where the Jewish priest stands out by being very careful not to become impure. Now, when we do a search in the 5 books of Moses to see where else is this kind of a verse where it repeats itself, say, speak and say, 2 times in the same verse, that from that we could learn also the idea of education. So in other words, we know that education is for everything. But sometimes there's only one verse, in our case 3 verses, that they become a role model for the rest of all the commandments. Not every commandment God has to remind everyone, don't forget to tell your children. So he tells it once or twice or 3 times in our case. And from that we learn for all the rest of them. So there's 2 more times. One is over here about purity and impurity. And the other 2 is very interesting. In one place, and there's more than one place in the Torah, where it speaks about not to eat blood. We have a commandment as Jews that not to eat blood. And the verse goes and says, Rak chazak, strengthen yourself and don't eat blood. And over there also it says the same idea, speak and say. So it's an idea where you have to educate your children that they should know that we don't eat blood. Rashi comments on the spot and he says that that was the norm. When we go back during the time when the Torah was given, close to 3,300 years ago, that was the norm, and even in certain segments today of the population is that way, that there's nothing wrong with eating blood. We know in Jewish custom how we are so strict that when, after slaughtering an animal that it is kosher, how much effort goes to take out the blood. We salt the meat, that the blood should be taken out. That's one of the ideas of kosher meat, that besides it was slaughtered, it was also butchered the right way, that no blood is left in the meat whatsoever. But in the olden days, that was the norm, was a normal thing. In other words, you couldn't say even such a thing, maybe it's disgusting. It was not disgusting. That was the normal thing to do. So here we see, as we're soon going to go into explain, so here we see that even in something that you could say, that's what everyone does. And then what everyone does is maybe that's not should be my first thing where I should try to educate my children to tell them that they should be different. Later on, maybe that shouldn't be the first thing. So here we see the Torah came and say, speak and say that you need to educate your children even on something where you'll think that this is the normal thing to do. So that is the second place where the Torah said that. Interesting what the third one is. The third one is when it came where the Torah says not to eat insects. So over there the Torah says again, speak and say. So all these creepy things, and that we shouldn't eat it. Now here's something very interesting, because here we could say that goes into the category of repulsive. There's many people that not necessarily going to eat that. Even people that, as we would say, don't keep kosher, but they're not going to eat these kinds of stuff because it's repulsive. So here's interesting. When it comes to things that are repulsive, comes the Torah and says, make sure you educate your children to stay away from it. Now, why were these 3 designated by God when he gave over the Torah to single them out that this should be the points of education? So let's explain this, because this is something very interesting based on some talks of the Lubavitcher Rabbi of blessed memories. So he brings out the idea of education is something very important. And many times, it's easy to give up hope. For who? For the educator. The educator is giving his heart, his soul in teaching and educating. May it be a teacher in school, may it be parents. They work very hard. And let's say 80%, 90% it works, but then there's 10% out there, in a nice way to say, that it doesn't work. You're trying, and it's not working. It's easy for the educator to give up, pick his hands up and say, it's not working, and I tried my best, and this is what it is. So the Torah gave us 3 examples to tell us that how we should double our efforts and not to give up. So let's look about these 3 cases, what it means. Let's say you're talking to a kid. You're talking to a child, your child or a student, and child says, but this is what my friends do. This is what everyone else is doing. In such a case, many times it could be very hard for parents or a teacher to tell to a kid, but you are different. We're trying to bring you up different. We're trying to tell you, you shouldn't be like others. There's no question it's much easier when the environment is cooperating and everyone in school is that way. But if, for example, you have a child in a high school, for example, where all the friends are doing something else, it becomes then very difficult for a parent and for teacher to the point where you want to give up and say, what can I do? That's what everyone else does. Comes the Torah, and that's the idea when it's talking about blood, because at that time when the Torah was given, that was the norm. Everybody used to drink or eat blood. Comes the Torah says, even that's the norm, you need to tell your child, we are different and we don't do that. The lesson from that will be for all kinds of situations, not just blood, but any kind of situation where the argument will be that since everyone does it, so therefore there's a limit what I can do. I tried, we'll finish. So the Torah says, speak and say, redouble your efforts, don't give up. Even in such a case, you need to tell them how important it is and how special you are. And I want to add on something that I mentioned earlier, that the word is here, Emor, in a softer language. Since we're talking about education, so here's something very important that our sages tell us. The success to tell a child, obviously there is the rules, that's the way it is, but with that, it must be a softer language. To be successful, the kid has to feel the friendship, and so there is the authority, but together with the authority, there has to be that they feel confident in the educator, and especially in parents. So the Emor, you are saying what you want, but it's a softer tone. It's a softer tone. It's not just a stick. And I would say it's more than a carrot and a stick. And that's the only way when there is sometimes tough situation, and someone comes and says, well, we gave them all the love that we can. The answer is to give more love. Because the other way we see doesn't work. So the only hope is to redouble the efforts in as much nice way possible. So here is a case where the child basically comes and says, that's what everyone does. Finished. And we tell him, even that's what everyone does, you shouldn't do it. Okay. Now comes the other case is about insect. Insect is in a situation where it's repulsive. If it's repulsive, sometimes a teacher or a parent will also give up. And they say, this child has crossed all lines, all normal lines. And if a person is behaving that way, and let's say in a case, the example will be eating insect, but could be any other thing that is so disgusting. A lot of times we as parents could give up and say, there's no hope. This is absolutely crazy what the person is doing. Not to compare, because it shouldn't happen, but let's say even because we live in a crazy world, a parent that a child wants to volunteer, I'm just using it as an example, to the crazy ISIS or things like this. So it comes a point where parents say, they're totally crazy, off the wall completely. We hear stories in Britain and other places where kids that grew up in normal homes decided to go volunteer, do crazy things, and we completely don't understand it. So a lot of times, some people would say, just give up, forget it. That's it, it's over. There's nothing you can do about this. Comes the Torah and teaches that even in a situation where there is a repulsive situation, don't give up. Emor ve'omarto, speak and say, and try as much as you can to try to change the situation. So we began with one situation that everyone does it. So it also becomes very hard to tell a child, don't do it, because you have to stand out. And here's the other extreme, where he has crossed the line. Nobody does it. He's the only one that does it, but he does such crazy things that in our eyes, it looks like that's it. You can't talk anymore to this person. He lost all his senses, him or she. So in that case, the Torah reminds us, never give up. Always, you have to talk, and again, with a softer way, and more ve'omarto. So that is the situation where the Torah spoke about blood, where the Torah spoke about insect. Here we come to the third one that is connected with over here. What is it saying over here? About the laws of purity and impurity. Let's understand first what the laws of purity and impurity. Those are laws that don't have any common sense. The only reason why is it so, because I believe that God said so. If God wouldn't have said such a thing, I would never enter my mind. So in other words, pure and impure has nothing to do with clean and unclean. Because then your hands are dirty, go wash your hands with soap. That's not what the Torah is talking about. The Torah is talking about that if a priest touched a dead body, somehow spiritually speaking, there's a spiritual uncleanness in this body, and if you touched it, you're going to have to purify yourself for 7 days, and then go to a ritual bath. So these are things that have no explanation in common sense. So when we do that, the only answer to that is because God said so. So that demands from the individual to believe. To believe, and if we talk about case as Jewish people, quite a few things you have to believe. You need to believe that God created the world. You need to believe also that this God that created the world had a revelation on Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, he gave us commandments. And these are the things that we need to do. So even when it comes certain times where common sense is screaming and yelling, it doesn't make sense. However, the Torah demands from me as an individual to overlook what's not common sense and say to myself, well, I believe in God, and since I believe in God, this is what I have to do. So this segment over here that speaks about educating the kids is a very important one. It talks about things where they don't make sense, and the only reason why we do it is because God said so. So I would think like this, that when it comes to educating our children, I would talk to them first about all things that make sense. I would leave all these things for later on when they're mature. Right now, why should I tell them and confuse them with things that don't make sense? We really, if we think about it, the kids, we don't realize that, or we do when we don't want to hear it. Our children are very sincere. And it's the biggest success is when you tell kids. And when you tell kids this is what God wants, you should know it registers by them even more so than adults. It's adults, as we mature, that's where our evil inclination gets involved and starts to sell us other kinds of stories. So the success really is when we're young. But as parent and as educator, many times we would say to ourselves, things that I can explain, let me start with that. But things I cannot explain, when they get older, I'll tell them. Comes this story here of our section over here, Emor v'amartain, the laws of purity and impurity, that even on things that don't make sense, that's when I should speak to the children. That's what I should educate them. So here we have these three ideas, and that's why the Torah selected these three. One is, even that everyone else is doing it, and you're trying to tell your child, don't do it. So in other words, you have to give them the courage to be different than everyone else. The other extreme is where the child has gone off his rocket and completely doing something crazy. So I would say, there's nothing I could do about this. This is an unusual case, and forget it. No, redouble my effort even in that situation. And then here, when it comes to things that don't make sense from a religious perspective, and the only reason why we're doing that because of our religion, because we are connected to God, and this is what God wants us, that also I should be telling my children. So that is the point of these three things, and it is connected with this section that speaks about Emor, speak. Speak to your children. What we see here, and this is another point about all that, is the power of speech. We know very well that there's the idea of thought, there's the idea of speech, and there's the idea of action. A very important part is the idea of speech. We know what speech could do. We know how we could say the wrong things, and it takes us a long time if we said something wrong, how to correct it. We could say something unwillingly and hurt somebody. So we know how important the idea of speech. So speech has a very important power, and this is what he's talking about. That the idea of education is connected with speech. Now we know something very important in education, because we're talking about education. You'll see many times parents would say, I already said once what the rules are to my kids. I don't have to repeat that all the time. And that's where the big mistake is. Because maybe the parents are getting tired from repeating themselves, but we know that's what's very important in education. Yes, parents or teachers, you're going to have to repeat yourself more than once. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Maybe once a day and every other day, who knows how many times, but that's part, not just of life, that's part of education. It takes time that it should enter, that it should register. And this is what it's talking about, the idea of Emor, the idea of saying. And here comes something very interesting in connection with that. Towards the end of the section I mentioned before, it speaks about the holidays and the Sabbath. Now here's something very interesting that was in the Jewish calendar, the way our calendar is put together. The Sabbath is something that has nothing to do with our action. It is automatically on the seventh day. And we go back to the creation. It says on 6 days God created heaven and earth. On the seventh day he rested. And then he comes by the Ten Commandments, and he says, because I had rested on the seventh day, I'm asking you to do the same. So he's asking us, Jewish people, to do the same thing. That has nothing to do, in a way, with our action. Our action is to observe it. But when is exactly the Sabbath? That is already set from day one. The first week, the seventh day, was Sabbath. And then it's continued, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And since then, since creation, it repeats itself. I saw something very interesting, by the way. The Kuzari is one of the known sages. He writes something very interesting, that many things in the world people have tried to change. You also have there was a time once they tried to change even the days of the week, but somehow it always stayed wherever we are, and this we unite in the whole world that way, that a week is 7 days. And that is based on the Torah, on the Bible. There's something very interesting, that it stayed that way with all the different changes, and everyone wants to change different things, but that has stayed. But for us, especially Jews, the 7th day is the Sabbath, the day after Friday evening and the Shabbat. Now, what about the other holidays? Here's something very interesting. That's where you need to know the calendar. If I want to know when Passover is, so that is the 15th of the month of Nisan. So I have to open the calendar and look what it is. So the way it is now in our calendar, it will be from the end of March till almost the 2nd or 3rd week in April. So you have 3 weeks there, and every year it changes. Some years a leap year, some year it's not a leap year. Same thing is the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, New Year's, is the 1st of Tishrei. Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei. And that always comes out again, end of September, middle of September, October. And same thing with Sukkot. How did it work with the calendar? So that we are told already in the book of Exodus, that God told Moses and Aaron that it'll be their thing, they're the one to do the calendar. Now we have a fixed calendar. But in the times of the temple, they used to look on the moon, and when they saw the new moon, that's how they based it. And how it was, the witnesses came, and they said, we saw the moon. The rabbis announced by saying and proclaiming, this is the month. So the holidays were based on the speech of the sages then. So what do we learn from it? We see how our speech could affect how the calendar should be. And that's a very important point. So this speech not only affects our day-by-day activities, but also the time. How do we elevate time, and how do we make the time should be holy? And that is the connection about all these segments of the Parsha that brings out how careful we should be with our speech, especially when it comes to the education of our children. May God help us that we should be successful in educating our children in the right way. Thank you.